Well, one of the things we wanted to do at first is get a feel for our audience, because we may talk about more things that are important to you depending on who you are. So just to help us get a feel for who's out there, can you raise your hand if you're an already existing organic row crop farmer, maybe been doing it for at least 3 years? Okay, so maybe half. Anybody out here that's conventional right now, conventional row crop, thinking about organic? Okay, so we have a fair amount. Okay. And anyone else? I don't really know why you're here, so. But have fun.
So this just deal with row crops? Not vegetable.
Okay, and I'm supposed to repeat every question too. So is this presentation dealing with just row crops? That's primarily what Paul and I do, is row crops with small grains in our rotation. So, yep, we won't be spending much time on vegetables or livestock. Okay, so we also wanted to say that we're not the experts. We haven't tried every tool out there. We haven't tried every single crop that's out there. We're just going to share our experience and what's worked for us. So hopefully you find that useful. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I want to say at the outset that this is kind of sponsored by the Iowa Organic Association, and they have a booth down. Thanks, Doug. They have a booth downstairs, so you can pick up one of these brochures. I'll just read what their mission is. Iowa Organic Association is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of Iowa's organic food and farming system. Iowa strives to advance organic opportunities by fostering education, research, promotion, and market development and policy. It was funded in 2006, serves as an umbrella organization to represent all of Iowa's organic farmers, gardeners, food and farm businesses, and consumers in building a more sustainable Iowa. So I want to encourage all of you to stop in at their booth downstairs and check out the information. Okay, my name is Paul Mugge. I farm by Sutherland, Iowa, in northwest Iowa. I've been organic for about 20 years. My phone number's up there, and any of you guys, especially that are thinking about transition, if you have any questions or just want somebody to talk to, feel free to
Paul.
give me a... Yeah, call Paul, right. Okay. I've been farming since 1976. It's been kind of a progression from fully conventional to now I'm fully organic on just 300 acres. I don't have any livestock anymore. I had hogs for quite a number of years. They weren't organic. My wife Karen and I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren.
Okay. Yep, I'm Zach Knutson. I live and farm near Meservey, Iowa, and also Iowa Falls, Iowa. Started farming part-time when I was working full-time for John Deere, and started off doing that organically because one of my uncles already had a certified organic farm. Added some conventional no-till acres in 2010, and I went full-time in 2012. We've got 4 kids, Daniel, Kaylee, Josie, and Avery. So actually we're 1 kid short on the combine there. That was a couple years ago, but I like that picture, so that's why I put it on there.
Okay, I think still need more organic farmers. The prices have come down a little bit for a number of reasons, but the organic industry in the United States is still growing. We got $43.3 billion last year in the organic industry. The number of organic farmers was up 12.8%, 15 over 14. We can't meet the demand for organic grain crops currently, so we need you. And our Organic Association is hopefully here to help you with that transition. So we will have a number of workshops throughout this year, and we'd like to have you there. Okay, for some of you newcomers especially that maybe not understand entirely what organic agriculture is, this is just a quick overview of the difference between our industrial agriculture and organic agriculture. Industrial wants to have a single species out there. If you have a cornfield, you want only corn, nothing else. Open cycles, especially for nutrients. Purchase inputs, more externalities. You're sending some of those inputs down the river. Very high energy use, and some of you may want to quibble with that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Low labor, and it's a very unstable system. If you don't provide those inputs, it's likely to crash and burn. On the other side, we seek to have more diversity and complexity rather than less. Very closed cycles, especially if you have livestock. Try to use free ecosystem services as opposed to purchase inputs. Fewer externalities because of that. Lower energy use, but higher labor use. And it's a much more stable system. And it's not easy. I don't want us to give that impression. If it were easy, everybody would do this, and we wouldn't get premium prices. But you know, if you're up for a challenge, it is very rewardable at the end of the day. So we're going to talk about weed control. I guess that's why you're here. And we no longer have that herbicide crutch to lean on. And Matt Liebman is here. I think he coined that phrase, many little hammers. We don't have the big one anymore, so we got to use a lot of little ones. Objectives, weed control. First and foremost, you have to limit the damage that's caused by competition, allelopathy, et cetera, maybe the costs of the controlling the weeds. Number two, you have to reduce the survival of weed seeds and propagules. That would be lowering your costs into the future. You have to keep stuff from going to seed, and you have to prevent the introduction of new weeds, such as palmer amaranth and giant ragweed. And again, if you have questions as we go along, please just raise your hand and ask. We just want to have more of a discussion workshop than a presentation.
Okay, we came up with 3 main methods of organic weed control. The first one is a biblical method, so you can hope and pray, all right? The next one is a secular method, so you just cross your fingers. And then the third one is the New Age hippie method. So just smoke some of your organic weed and it'll all be okay, all right? So I just had to do that. All right, now we'll get serious. I think Paul and I both agree that crop rotation is your most and first consideration when you're talking about weed control. We both have a 3-year rotation, so corn, beans, small grain, then we go back to corn. We like at least a 3-year rotation. Some people have a lot longer rotation, and that helps even more, but at least with a 3-year rotation, you're really hurting your soybean cyst nematode, the corn rootworms that will only hatch, the second year afterwards. So it's good for disease and weeds too, though. Like for row crops, you're typically planting your corn and beans a little bit later, and so you can get some of those early germinating weeds, like the mare's tail, giant ragweed, lamb quarters. With the small grains, you're harvesting those earlier, so you can catch some of those weeds before they go to seed, like the foxtail that might come up through the oats, or the giant ragweed that's big but it hasn't quite gone to seed yet. So each crop gives you a little different way to help control the weeds just with the timing alone. There's lots of different ways you can switch up your rotation. You can have grasses, legumes, annuals, and perennials. Some of the perennials, maybe like an alfalfa, can really help with weed control. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. So go ahead, Paul, why don't you go to the next one?
Okay. One other thing I'd like to say right now is we have a lot of very established organic farmers in this room that have been doing this for a long time, and there's a lot of knowledge here, and I'm hoping that you guys interject some of your extensive knowledge as we go along here too. The reason for crop rotations is we intend to disrupt pest-like cycles. If you're raising just corn and soybeans, you have 2 summer annual row crops, and you're going to have particular weeds that are adapted to that particular system, and those are going to get out of hand. We're trying to avoid that, so we rotate row crops with solid seeded crops, for example. We have summer annuals, winter annuals, and perennials that you can use in the mix to disrupt those weed cycles and insect cycles. You need a complex rotation, but you don't want to be married to it. Weeds will kind of adapt to what you have, and you need to change it up once in a while. One thing that I have now is morning glory that's kind of trying to take over because I have clover in with my small grain, and I just clip it. I may have to go back to disking that up after small grain harvest just to get rid of those morning glories. You just have to mix things up once in a while.
So yeah, like I said, our current rotations are corn, beans, small grain. Paul likes the winter triticale, red clover. I believe that's because you sell that seed. Yep. My standby is corn, beans, oats, alfalfa. But we both have tried some of those other ones below too. So. Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more, but it's 1 year planting oats and alfalfa at the same time, and then terminating that later in the fall. So, yep. We did want to talk a little bit about planting and seed considerations and how that pertains to organics and weed control. Your population really depends on your soil, your fertility, row spacing, variety. You don't want to crowd your plants too much because then they'll be weak and fall down. But if you don't plant a thick enough stand, you're going to have more sunlight come through. That's going to help weeds germinate. Planting date, we like to do as early as possible for small grains. Small grains can germinate and start to grow before a lot of our weed species, before the soil is warm enough for a lot of them to germinate. So getting a head start on those weeds with the small grains by getting them in as early as possible is a good thing. Whether that's a winter, like a winter rye or a winter triticale, or early in the spring as possible with oats. So seed selection is really important too. You want seed with a strong germination, strong emergence, because you want it up and out of the ground as quick as possible to compete against the weeds. Early canopy is good. Cut the sunlight off from reaching the ground. That's going to stop weeds from germinating. And just being able to yield in the presence of those weeds too. Some hybrids and varieties can withstand a lot better competition out there than others. So Paul and I both agree on the next statement too. We've replanted many times because if you have a poor stand, not only is it going to hurt your yield, but you're going to have more weed seeds at the end of that year, and it's just going to make it tougher the next year. So if you've got a not so good stand out there, don't be afraid to rip it up and start over. You're going to like looking at it a lot better too through the year.
Yeah. In my experience, it hurts to replant, but every time that I have, when I've been faced with that decision that I have decided to replant, I was always glad I did. And when I decided not to, I always wished I would have. Tom?
Yeah, and that is a different world in conventional agriculture. There are situations where they could do very well on a replant consideration. And organic, I think you got to go by a higher standard. I agree with your comments on that totally, to the point that I think you want to start the season with some reserves of seed, early maturing seed on hand. So if you get in trouble, it's a Saturday afternoon, you don't have any problem with the seed you got sitting in the shed over there, rip it up, we're done by dark.
Yep, I've had to scramble for seed before, and that's not a lot of fun.
Yes. What row spacing have you found works the best to suppress weeds?
The question is about row spacing. Narrow rows is kind of a mixed bag. Zach and I are both on 30-inch rows. Yeah, you can shade the weeds out sooner with narrower rows, but the trade-off is you're covering a smaller percentage of the area with your cultivator. So I'm not sure that that's a battle you can win. I would hate to go narrower than 30 inches.
Yeah, and the other part of it is just equipment availability. We're pretty standard here with 30-inch, and so, if you want to do custom work for other people, or you're just looking for equipment, or let's say you get hurt or injured and need some help in the field. If you have something that's very unique that no one else in your community has, then you're kind of out there all on your own. I like the 30-inch rows just because it's more standard. It's easier to find the equipment. I can go help somebody. Someone can help me. It's just a lot more interchangeable. So it's not just the weed control issue I'm thinking about when I think about row spacing.
I went through a lot of work to go to 24-inch row beams and ran that way for about 4 or 5 years and went back to 36-inch rows because I didn't think it was the weak link in getting bean yields. I thought 10 years ago it was the weak link with row spacing. And I admitted after a lot of work it wasn't the correct approach. I should have stayed in 36-inch rows. So in other words, I did not gain by narrowing rows. I gained by improving cultural practices.
Yep. Paul, you want to go ahead and talk about yours
okay.
first? Okay.
For corn, for me, the corn follows the small grain. It had red clover. So I usually disc that in the fall because I'm putting on some compost or chicken litter, and I need to incorporate it a little bit, so I disc it in the fall. The red clover that I have is a variety that was developed at University of Florida. I think they use it for forage down there, and my thinking was that it wouldn't overwinter up here because I don't do any primary tillage. I don't want to plow it. So I want it to die over the winter, and in a hard winter it will, in a mild winter a lot of it will come back, but by the time I disced it and field cultivated in the spring, it's pretty much gone. It's easy to kill, and I get maybe 80 pounds of nitrogen from it. Field cultivate twice in the spring. I plant about 35,000 plants, and harrowed or rotary hoed, depending on the season, if it's wet or dry, probably 3 times, cultivated 3 times. And part of that is because I'm on a ridge plant system, and I have to build a pretty big ridge to plant beans on the following year, so I'm going to cultivate that corn 3 times if possible. I do have RTK guidance. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Zach?
Okay. Yep. That's weird. Okay. I'll try not to. Yeah, so I've got the alfalfa in the previous year, and then the fall of that alfalfa, I incorporate the manure, usually a turkey litter. Then I use a ripper and rip that in. The ground that I've got currently in organic is really heavy, black, flat. And so part of the reason of ripping it is just to help it so it can dry out the next spring. And in the next slide, we'll see what that alfalfa looks like even after it's been ripped. But yeah, so even though I use a ripper through it, that's what it can look like the next spring. It doesn't kill all of it, but it just slows it down enough so I don't have too much biomass out there and I can't plant through it because I've just got a mess of stuff. So anyways, so in the spring, I'll take my soil finisher through that clover that you just saw 2 or 3 times, plant it. The plant population would be based on soil type. Your lower quality soils, I'm not going to plant as thick. And the good stuff, you plant a little thicker. It can handle it. The blind cultivation, so that's after planting, but before the crop emerges. Ideally, I'd like to hit that twice, maybe once right after planting and another one just before the corn emerges, just so that corn can get a head start on the weeds. And what you're trying to do there is kill the little weeds you can't even see yet, the ones that have germinated, and maybe they have a little white root on them, just like that. You come along and scrape them out. Then after that, cultivate twice, hopefully 3 times if the weather cooperates. I do my early passes with the front mount cultivator, so it's a 12-row 30 John Deere front mounted cultivator on an open station 4430 tractor, so pretty old school technology. But we'll talk more about how that works and why I do that. Later on, then I use a navigator system with a rear mount cultivator for my final cultivations. And if we need to walk the corn, we do that too. So.
Okay, for beans, I mentioned I'm on a ridge plant system, and I'm probably the only guy in Iowa that does this, but I plant my beans before I plant the corn. I plant beans probably the first week in May, just because they're up on a ridge where it's warm and dry and it's just a perfect seed bed. And in my experience, I don't want to plant corn too early because I've had to replant it. Someone mentioned earlier that, you know, we have untreated seed, and there's a reason that they started treating seed, you know, with fungicides. If it doesn't grow immediately, something's going to eat it. So I usually wait till the middle of May at least to plant the corn for that reason, because I don't want to replant. So I plant the beans first, and they come up immediately. I try and rotary hoe twice before they come up, and somebody did some research that figured out about when, based on degree units, that those weeds were in that right stage to control with a rotary hoe, and it works out to about every 3 or 4 days during that period of year with average weather. So if I can plant them, rotary hoe at about 3 days, and then again in 3 days after that, then let them come up, because they're kind of vulnerable at that cotyledon stage, and then I'll probably hoe them again when they're, as soon as they leaf out, and then I start cultivating, like when they're 3 inches tall. Yes?
Are you hoeing on top of the ridge too? Do you have a unit on top of the ridge?
Yeah, the hoe is full width. Yeah, the wheels that are on top of the ridge where the row is, those are the wheels that I've replaced that have good spoons on them, and the ones that are in the middles are the ones that are pretty much worn out because I'm going to cultivate there anyway. But yeah, I rotary hoe the whole field. You have to go pretty fast to keep it from plugging up, you know. Yes?
Why do you not use the harrow?
Why do I not use the harrow? Thank you. I use the harrow in the corn, but in beans with ridge plant, I have a lot of residue out there. I have an Einbach tine weeder. It'll go through it. It won't really plug up, but it fills up. And then when you lift it on the end, it'll leave a big bunch of trash there. But I have done it, but rotary hoe usually works a little better. Cultivate 3 times. Cloudbuster, I have some pictures of that. I'll talk about that maybe a little later, and I do walk the beans for broadleaves.
Okay. And so, yeah, these are our ideal situations. You know, the weather dictates what we do every year, of course, but I start off by chopping the stalks in the fall, and then I'll rip it just because I want to keep that residue under control. I don't want it plugging up my cultivators. I'll soil finish 2 to 3 times in the spring, and I'll spread those out. So, you know, as soon as I can get in the field, it's dry enough, go out and kill the early sprouted weeds, let another flush of weeds come through, and hit them down again, and then plant right after that. The plant population is really higher than it needs to be. If you're conventional, you know, Iowa State says in a good ideal seed bed, you know, you can plant 140,000. We go a little bit higher because we know we're going to knock some of them out with a rotary hoe or with the harrow. So, yeah, ideally, blind harrow once. Maybe you could do it twice, just depending on how fast they come out of the ground. In a really warm situation, beans can be right at the surface to where you can break them off in 5 days. So rotary hoe a couple times would be ideal. I've always done it after they come up. I didn't know Paul did it before, so that's interesting. I learned something. Yeah, cultivate usually at least 3 times. Again, early I do it with the front mount and later with the rear mount, and we'll walk the field once and maybe go back with a quick pass a second time just to get any ones that that have escaped. So.
Okay, this is just after it's been ridge planted, beans following corn. That's after they've been hoed 3 times. And these have been cultivated twice. They haven't been walked yet. You can see a weed here and there. And I kind of like this picture because there's a lot of residue, a lot of corn residue between the rows for preventing erosion, keeping the soil surface a little cooler, and that's what you get with ridge tillage. And I want to say too, these pictures look really good, but it doesn't always look this way. You take the picture where it looks really good, all right? I have some pictures later on where it doesn't look so good, and you have to expect that. It's not always going to look, Roundup ready. For small grains, again, I plant winter triticale. It's drilled, no-till drilled right behind the combine, and then I just overseed it with the red clover. In the spring, I might say it's frost seeded, but generally we go from a foot of snow to a foot of mud overnight. So most of the time, I don't seed that clover till April when it's dry, and it takes very little moisture to get it started. I've had really good luck with that. I do walk it some for thistles. We'll talk about thistles later on too. I don't want them going to seed. Originally, one of the reasons that I started with the fall seeded crop was I thought that I would harvest it before those thistles went to seed. That didn't really turn out to be the case, but so you do have to control that. I harvest both the grain and the straw, and soon as the clover is maybe 6 inches tall, so I can combine that triticale right over the top, and it'll really take off then. And by about Labor Day, it'll be 2 feet tall and flowered out, and I'll clip it, and then it will get ahead of the weeds, and there will be basically no weeds in it the rest of the year, and it'll be, a foot and a half tall again by freeze up, or when I disc it.
And you clip it around Labor Day.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
To keep the weeds down that came up through.
Yeah,
too.
there'd be a few come up.
Yep.
When you say clip it, are you making hay or are you just mowing?
No, thanks, Scott. The question is, I was ahead of you. The question is whether I clip it to make hay or not. No, it's strictly a cover crop. I've got a disc mower. I just go out and clip it, and then it comes back again. And you get that much more biomass, and I don't know if it, once it flowers, does it kind of quit producing nitrogen that it would start again if you mow it? Matt or Margaret or some of you guys, does it, as far as nitrogen production, are you ahead if you clip it? Or does it come out the same if you leave it?
Yeah, I want to see somebody's data. My guess is you do, because you're dropping that stuff on the soil surface, you're starting to get some breakdown. And
Yeah.
yes, then you're getting some additional fixation.
Yeah. Margaret says you're better off to clip. That was,
Oh, that's a guess. I really haven't
yeah.
seen data.
Well, that was my guess too. That's why I do it. Matt, you got a feeling for that?
You open up the canopy when you clip it, so you get new growth.
Right.
And as the stuff breaks down on the soil surface, some of that nitrogen will go in and the red clover will feed on it rather than fixing more. But I suspect that as the residue level builds up on the soil, it cools the soil, retains more moisture, you get regrowth, and you probably wind up with more nitrogen after you've clipped.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Any other questions? Where we at?
Yep. So, okay, I'll talk about my small grain. I'll soil finish it in the spring for the oats. When you're cultivating the beans, you've got some ridges and rolls, and I don't really like going over those when we're combining and running wagons and grain cart. And then when we go to bale the straw and I actually harvest the alfalfa typically too then around Labor Day. And so I want to try to get those ridges from the old bean rows out. So I soil finish it, try to level it out. We use a no-till drill, 7.5 inch spacings, drill the oats and the alfalfa. And actually we changed our grain drill. Originally, the tubes for the alfalfa seed will go down into the same row or the furrow as the oats. Well, you want to plant oats at an inch deep, but you just want alfalfa seed just on the surface, maybe a 1/4 inch deep at most. So we took the tubes out for the alfalfa and just let those run out on the ground ahead of the drill. So we're not really burying those, and it's more of a solid seeded alfalfa than in drilled rows. So we like that. I've had good stands with that. And then just to kind of smooth everything off, I'll take the old drag out there and run that over the field too quick. Doesn't cost much and just helps incorporate that alfalfa a little more. Yeah.
What kind of a drill do each one of you run?
Okay. The question was, what kind of drill do we run? We've got, I have my dad run the drill, and it's a 750 John Deere.
I have a Great Plains. It's 15 feet, so it just matches my 30-inch rows. So, and I've adjusted the height of the coulters so that they follow the ridges, you know, because after you cultivate the beans 3 times, you've got pretty good ridges out there. So I adjust the height of the coulters so that everything gets seeded about the same depth. And, you know, it looks fairly black at first, but if you come back in a week, you can't really even see where you drilled. Most of that residue is still on the surface. You get pretty good controlling resources.
What's your spacing?
7.5 or 8. The question was about the spacing.
Okay.
Any other questions?
You want to go back? You want to go back one for me? Okay. Yep. We'll actually walk our oats too if necessary. Yeah, if there's a giant ragweed out there, get out there, pull that. Wild mustard, and the thistles too. So we harvest the grain and the straw. I use some of the straw myself, market it as well. That can be a little tougher to market, but once you build some relationships with people, you can move some of it. And yeah, I harvest the alfalfa too. It's not a big money maker, but I'm clipping it anyways to keep the weeds down, and so I can sell that and have a little extra income too. Spread my equipment costs out a little bit. Yeah.
Are you windrowing or are you direct cutting your small grains?
Okay, question was, how do we harvest the grain? I've done it both ways. There's pros and cons to both. If it's standing nice, you can take it, if the grain is standing nice, you can take it standing with a bean head, lock the cutter bar up, and you can get more acres done because you're putting less material through the combine. But then if you want to harvest the straw, you've got to come back and cut that straw lower. So you've got 2 passes there anyways. If the grain's down and it's starting to get all tangled up in the alfalfa or the clover, then we would use the swather, swath it, let it dry as long as we can. The last few years have really been a challenge to get that crop out of the field without the windrows getting rained on. So you have a greater weather risk when you windrow it too. So there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah, I agree. I combine mine standing up as much as possible. Also, my history is whenever I windrow something, it rains about 3 inches on the windrows and you can't get them dry. The caveat is if you're going to combine it straight, you really need to put it in a bin and get some air on it because it'll heat up pretty quickly otherwise.
Zach,
Yeah.
can you talk about your seeding rates for the oats and alfalfa?
Yeah, question was seeding rates on the oats and alfalfa. Kind of the old school standard is 3 bushels an acre for oats. You can get a little more scientific, and if your seed supplier can tell you how many seeds are in a pound of oats, then you could get more down to a pound thing. And there's actually some publications online. Trying to think who did those. Maybe through grain millers. Actually, they have an oat expert that will tell you how many seeds per square foot you should shoot for. So I would try to find that online because I don't remember that number offhand. I don't want to give it to you. The alfalfa, 10 to 12 pounds an acre, can give you a good seeding if everything goes right. I don't think you need to go higher than that. You're just probably throwing money away.
I was just curious if you use a draper head, if you're windrowing, and then what kind of combines you use, and if you use a rotary combine, if you change the concaves.
The question is about the type of windrower and the type of combine. You want to take that? Or?
Sure. So the windrower is a early 90. I actually custom hire that done because I don't have one. It takes a 13-foot swath, which doesn't seem like much, but if your oats are this tall and you're taking 13 foot of that, that's a good load for an average size combine. And if you get any bigger than that, your windrow is not going to dry out when it's hot and humid. So I've learned that from Doug back there that you don't want to get too big of a swath or too big of a swath because it's going to cause you more problems than it's worth. So, it has draper belts, and it very gently takes it from the cutter bar, lays it down in the draper, and then puts it in the windrow. It doesn't go through a conditioning unit or anything like that. I've got a rotary combine. It's a Case IH 2166, and yes, I do have the small grain concaves, and I switch those out for it. And I think that's a good thing to do. If you're going to do small grains, get the small grain grates.
Yeah, I have a Case IH combine too, a 1666. I do switch concaves like you do. I also have some cover plates. If you cover the first about 2/3 of the concave, rather than just forcing those heads right through the concave immediately, it forces them to go around once or twice, so you get a little better threshing. The triticale threshes really hard, but I think it would help with other small grains too. Pardon me?
So you got a belt pickup on the front of that combine.
I do if it's windrowed, yeah, and I just use my regular soybean head, tie it up if I take it standing up, right? The question was about the pickup for the combine.
Yeah, there's special locks that you can get to lock your cutter bar up. If you're taking them standing, you'll want to get those, and then you just run your head manually like you would a corn head. So.
And it feeds so much more evenly, I think, if you take it standing up than it does picking it up for a windrow, in my experience.
Yeah, and unless it's short or your clover or your alfalfa is getting so tall that you have to clip some of that in order to get all the oats, then that green stuff, it's heavier, it can start to build up on the cutter bar. I've got an air reel actually on my soybean head, and so that air reel really helps feed that crop in smoothly if I'm taking it standing too. So that does help.
Okay, this slide's just in here kind of to introduce the next topic a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the cultural things that we can do, and we've already talked about quite a few of them. This is one of the slides that I lifted from one of Matt's publications of a few years ago. The physical only, the vertical scale is the cost per hectare. You know, if you did this system for 5 years, at the end of 5 years, how much money are you going to be spending for weed control? And if you only did physical things like cultivating, for example, in that end of 5 years, you're going to be spending, you know, $550 per hectare for weed control. The difference between the red and the red is crop loss and the blue is control. As you start adding other things in, other cultural things like planting late, higher population, some of those things, you know, one extra thing or two or three, your costs per hectare at the end of 5 years are going down. So if you can have the physical things plus 3 other cultural things, you know, on average, you've reduced your costs for weed control by like 25 or 30% at the end of 5 years. Allelopathy. This slide was on my farm. This is winter triticale on the right and flax on the left. Now, these rows run north and south, so we're looking north. So I don't really think this is a light effect, but there's actually another row of flax in here that isn't even really there. So you can see how much that triticale, which is a hybrid between winter wheat and winter rye, has a lot of allelopathy. Even up 2 feet away, it's still inhibiting the growth of that flax. If you aren't familiar with allelopathy, it's some plants, notably rye, they exude allelochemicals from their roots, and that inhibits the germination and early growth of other seeds, especially really small seeds. It's like one plant saying, you know, there's only room here for one of us, and I was here first. And so I think there's a lot of work being done now actually on trying to breed cover crops to have more allelopathic effect. Seed predation, and this is some more work that Matt's done. Somebody counted, some grad student, I'm sure, that one female cricket ate 223 pigweed seeds in one day. The point here is that if you leave these seeds on the soil surface for a longer period of time, something is going to eat them. If you have only invertebrates like crickets and carabid beetles, like in my system, I don't do any tillage, so those seeds are on the surface from October until May. So I've got 7 months in there where between the invertebrates and field mice are there all year long, they're going to eat, 60 or 70% of the weed seeds that are there. And I'm sure birds probably take a toll on them as well. The key is you have to leave them on the surface. If you do tillage, you've got them buried where those creatures can't get at them. You may need to provide some habitat for them in field borders or other areas so they have something to eat when there aren't weed seeds out there to eat, because they need cover and they need winter habitat. This is just the red clover before it was clipped in the fall. Composting, if you're getting manure, it's probably going to pay to compost from a weed control standpoint. The temperature of the compost, it needs to be 20 degrees at 113 degrees to kill all the weeds, or 3 days at 130 degrees, and that curve meets both of those requirements, so most of those weed seeds are being destroyed in the compost. It does stabilize the nutrients and reduces the volume of the material also. This is 3 weeds before they went through the cow. Pig weeds, 98% of them were viable. After passing through digestion, they're down to 36. And after 3 months of storage, down to 12. Foxtail is down to almost 0 if you compost it. Yes, Margaret?
Just a comment though, in a, I don't know the term, informal compost pile, if you're not turning it regularly, you achieve those temperatures inside, but you're going to have a cap out there that doesn't achieve those temperatures.
That's right. The comment was about whether you turn that pile or not. If you do it the cheap and easy way like I do, the surface of the pile is not heating up as much as the interior of the pile. So you could have some weed seeds on the surface. A lot of times I'll just I put one of my grandkids on a tractor with a manure spreader, and I'll just keep loading it on the manure spreader and just make a new windrow. That's kind of the cheap guy's way of doing it. But. Okay, what's next?
Do you monitor the temperature?
I don't anymore. I did for a while. Yeah.
All right. So we talked about crop rotations, talked about some other cultural methods. Now we wanted to get into tool talk. So talking about the different mechanical tools that are out there. And we won't even touch on all of them. So, but I wanted to make the point about seedbed tillage and the planter and having the planter set right. So they say all this stuff is important in conventional farming. I would argue that it's even more important in organic. If you don't do a good job of seedbed prep and have a level seedbed, Paul's an exception with the ridge till. Obviously, he doesn't want it level, but he wants a consistent seedbed. And our planters need to be in good working order. So I'll go through and explain that a little bit. Obviously, if you're tilling, you want to kill all those weeds that are up and green that you see. You don't want to have a sweep missing on a shank. You don't want to leave gaps, between your passes. You want to make sure everything is killed, because otherwise it's just going to be harder and harder to kill that weed later, and you're going to have to go out and walk and pull it because it'll keep missing on the row crop cultivator or whatever. You want it nice and uniform and level, so all of your subsequent tools will work well through it. And I would say, do your tillage on warm, sunny days. I don't know if I'd be doing it at night when it's humid. You might clip a weed, but at night it might not kill it well enough or fast enough, and maybe it could regrow. The planter, we want a consistent depth and a consistent spacing. If you've got seeds too shallow and you come through with your drag or your harrow or your rotary hoe, you're going to flip those seeds out, or they won't germinate at the same time. You've got uneven germination, so you don't know when you should be cultivating for that seed that just came up, or should you be cultivating for the one that's this tall. With a consistent spacing, if you've got skips and gaps in your row, well, then all of a sudden you've got an extra space for weeds to compete. because they're going to get sunlight a little bit longer right there. So, like I said, it's important for conventional, but it's even more important for us, I think. Attachments you can use to help. Oh, go ahead.
I'd like to ask both of you to respond on your seedbed tillage. View that differently. Do you view it differently if it's perennial weeds or annual weeds?
Question is, seedbed tillage, is it different on perennial versus annual? No. And for me, I guess I haven't thought about that. I'm just out there and I get it in the ground, make sure it's killing everything, whatever it is.
Yeah. For thistles, I want to make sure that I have everyone cut off. But the only, the small grain is no-till drilled, the soybeans are ridge-tilled, so I'm not really doing much pre-plant tillage in the first place. What do you do?
Well, the world I live in, it was similar to what my dad grew up in. Perennials are bad. We do with annuals as well, but between quackgrass and Canada thistle, I've learned that between quackgrass and Canada thistle, it really is a different world. And I was talking to an old farmer years ago, and he said, you know, you got to understand what a quack digger is. And so I took an international field cultivator, those old ones, and I took the shovels off of it, and I put the spikes on. And I've got 2 years running on it now, but I'm after quackgrass and Canada thistle. And the reason that spike is on that field cultivator is that it's not designed to shear things off. It's designed to drag roots up the surface and kill them. So
Okay. Yeah,
when I'm in pre-plant tillage, I'm in one of two worlds. But if I'm after perennials, I'm focused on those roots, and I don't want them sheared. So the self-finisher to me is not the tool, it's the quack digger.
All right. So with those two weeds he's talking about, I know on thistles, I'm pretty sure on quack, I don't have quack grass, but they have horizontal roots. And so what you're trying to do is not just break them off at the top, but you're trying to bring those horizontal roots up that they spread by and get those up on the surface so they dry out and die. Okay.
I think part of the secret of that is you have to get those rhizomes chopped up in small enough pieces that if you drag it to some other part of the field, it might start growing and you have a new patch. You have to get shorter pieces.
My mistake has been to shear them off and think I was doing a good job. I want them drug up the surface and starve to death. Something like that. But totally different, perennials or annuals, completely different.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I've heard of that tool recently for the first time, a quack digger. It's funny. But we're going to talk more about thistles too. So they're a bugger. Those, it's probably just best to not let them get in your field in the first place, especially if you're transitioning and you've got a clean field. It's a lot easier to keep it clean than to try to clean up a mess later. Just some of the attachments on the planter. Row cleaners can help, especially if you've got some clods. Row cleaners can really help keep that planter box and that row unit running nice and level and be in a consistent depth in the ground. It can also remove any residue that might stall the seeds out from coming up, so they all get up more uniform. Seed firmers with spike closing wheels. So the seed firmer just gets the seed at the bottom of the furrow, so it's a more uniform depth, gets it into the moisture, pushes it down there a little bit farther. It helps with germination and even emergence. The spike closing wheels, instead of using the round rubber ones that pack and possibly could help weeds germinate right in the row, if you can use a spiked closing wheel and loosen that dirt back up again right above the seed, that's a less ideal environment for a weed seed to germinate because it's not as compacted. You could also use a chain. Sometimes you can, on the old planters, they used to use a harrow to incorporate herbicide. You could also maybe use a harrow behind each planter unit too, just to kind of fluff it up and bring any weed seeds that you might have compacted at the surface back up to stay dry and keep from germinating. So these are some of the different tools that are out there that you can use for your early cultivations. So we talked about the rotary hoe. That's the two bottom pictures. Paul, you want to point to one of the tips of the spoons on the green ones? The really important things about about the rotary hoe is to make sure the spoon width is near new. Once those get too wore out, they don't throw as much dirt, and they're not as effective. So make sure your hoe tips are 80% of new, and you can find those dimensions from Deere or from Yetter. Yeah.
Doug?
Pull a dime out of your pocket, set it on the spoon. If it's narrower than the dime, replace the wheel.
Or they have the hoe bits that you can weld on too that make it really aggressive, I think. Doug's comment was if your spoons get narrower than the width of a dime, it's time to replace them. Comment on the flamer. Some of you established guys, how many of you use flame cultivators? Quite a few of you. Okay. I guess I'd appreciate comments from some of you that have used them. Are they a good tool?
Absolutely. I've got a picture on my phone. You won't like the looks of the corn after I went through it.
Yeah.
When I went to harvest it, I don't think there was probably a 10 bushel decrease.
Right. I have.
I did it on the buffer strips on some field. I thought, let's sacrifice the least valuable corn. And I'm still learning on the flamer.
Yeah. I think they've gotten better the last few years. The University of Nebraska has done quite a bit of work.
Well, if you use a flamer, they'll give you a book that has a formula for different size weeds and target places to start to set your pounds of LP you need to burn,
Yeah.
and then the speed you need to drive.
Right. I have one. I haven't used it for several years. Last time I used it, I had it mounted on an old International cultivator with rubber gauge wheels, and started one of those rubber gauge wheels on fire that was right behind the cultivator, or right behind the tractor tire. And I had a dirt shovel along just for that contingency, but every time you throw a shovel full of dirt on it, the wheel just turns and it keeps right on burning. And I didn't want to set it down on the ground because I thought it'd start the field on fire, and if I raised it up, I thought it'd start my tractor tire on fire, so it's been in the shed ever since. I know some people use them pretty effectively.
Well, yeah, I got a question for you flamers out there. Do you plan to use it every year, or is it more of an emergency last resort tool? Every year?
Do you use it on beans and corn?
I've never used it on beans yet, but I'm going to try this year.
Yeah. I used it on beans, just in the cotyledon stage. You're right over the top, and it just singes them, but doesn't hurt them a bit. And it worked pretty good. It got those weeds kind of on the side of the ridge that the planter sweep didn't quite get, and the cultivator disc didn't quite get. It got those. But
Basically, what I've been told is go out and flame it. We flame over the top, you know. You want to do that with 12 inches.
mhm,
Flame right down in the swirl, it'll kill it.
right.
You can do that to about 12 inches. And we flame right over the top with the hood. Then we wait 3 days for weather permitting, come in and cultivate it, and
Right.
we walk away,
Yeah.
pretty much.
Because the flamer will wilt those weeds, and then you can cover them up with the cultivator. Right. Tom?
Yeah, very effective on quack grass and most grasses. Totally ineffective on giant ragweed unless the ragweed is really, really small.
Yeah, the ragweed just has too many growing points.
Yeah, the other tool up there we haven't talked about yet is my sort of homemade Kovar harrow. So I bought the black tined units separately, and then there's the blue part that's a wishbone, so it can flex. Each part of that harrow can flex. It's on a 30-foot toolbar, just an old cultivator toolbar, nothing special. But you can order those blue. I don't know, wishbone, we'll call them, parts from a company out in New York, and they actually just bought the Kovar company, so now they can give you that whole thing. There's a different aggressiveness levels you can set on that harrow, and you can use that for a blind cultivation, so before the crop is up, or you can actually use it after the crop is up too. Maybe not so much for corn, but beans. It can just help get those real tiny weeds right up along the row early on. Here's some other potential tools you can use for those blind and early, well, these would mostly be blind cultivations. There's just several different types of harrows out there and drag. I've got the old school drags out there in the grove. Just below that is a spike tooth drag, but that's like a McFarlane, and I think there's 16 bars on that. So you're moving every single piece of dirt with that thing. The top right one is called a Wingfield harrow. So it's a chain design, a little bit different. I know some larger organic farmers that really like that tool for their blind cultivation, so they use that 1 or 2 times right after they plant. That really moves a lot of dirt too and fluffs it up, levels it out. The bottom one is very similar to that Kovar harrow I had in the previous slide, but it's a bent tined weeder harrow. And the brand name of that one is an Einbach.
It's the Einbach that I have. The advantage of that is that, as opposed to the ones that are hanging from chains, is that it's pretty heavy and you can tilt it back. You can actually put a lot of down pressure on it. You can do quite a bit of tillage with it. If you go just a couple days after you plant, you can get it in the ground a long ways.
Yep.
Yes. Doug.
After some time, what's your preference on type of tine on the Einbach type?
Okay, the question is about the type of tine. Mine's an older one, so it doesn't have those really long tines, and I actually straightened the tines a little bit. Mine aren't, it's kind of hard to see. Mine aren't really that almost 90-degree angle that they come with. What's your opinion?
I have none, I'm asking. I do not own one yet.
Oh, well, Einbach's a really good machine. It has a tooth every inch as you go across its width, where some of the other ones are 1.5 inches. So you might be paying 1.5 times as much for it, but you've got 1.5 times as many teeth. So it's a really good machine. Yes, sir.
Those machines also have hydraulic adjustment, and that's really nice so you can control it.
Oh, if you have the hydraulic upper link.
No, hydraulic on the tines to stand them up taller.
Oh,
and back.
I don't have that.
Crash and they start plugging.
Yeah,
Back them off, and then when you can be as aggressive as you can. Then.
that's a good idea.
It's a nice feature. It's a little
Yeah,
expensive, but
I don't have that.
Yeah, I think it's an option. You can get it mechanical or hydraulic.
Yeah.
The advantage of the longer tines is, especially when you're doing corn, that if it's hard on the corn, that the longer tines will move sideways and work around that corn plant and not be as hard on the crop.
How big a corn do you cultivate or till with that? Yeah, Scott.
You're probably done up to 6 inches tall.
And he's done up to 6-inch corn and not hurt the stand?
Not anymore in a rotary hoe, I mean.
Okay.
Sure.
All right.
And we're going pretty slow though.
Yeah, I'll bet. I've tried it, but I just killed a lot of corn, so. Tom?
Well, if there's new people in the room looking into organic, they should really make the cultivator hookup as easy as possible and go to top link hydraulic right away. You don't want to make it difficult to pick a cultivator up and drop it off, or to spend a lot of time getting your top link right. And when you're cultivating, you want to be able to change that on the go. Of all the mistakes made over the years, I've got now, so it's as easy as possible to do these things. Of course, you get older, the better you're gonna. But the top link, hydraulic top link, I think is the must.
Right. Or lift assist wheels and know exactly where to put them. In the back.
I just have a quick question. This year I planted some winter wheat and I used a mulcher to set my seed bed before I filled it in. And I noticed on that it has quite a few settings and you can put some shoes on that or some teeth, behind it. I got a wild idea. I thought about trying to use that for blind cultivation. Just barely set those teeth in on lightly preparing the seed bed, only just, they don't go in hardly at all. Think that would be a disaster?
You'd have to be careful, I guess, but I'm sure it would work.
Wouldn't that create an ideal seed bed for weeds?
If you're packing it. Yeah.
So you're talking about, it's got the heavy cast wheels on the front, the Coulter Packer type thing, but then you've got sweeps on the back.
Actually in between the two rolls.
Oh, in the middle.
So it'd be like when you're trying to see that you have not a lot of trash, but a little bit rougher, you can set the things anywhere from a half inch in the ground to probably 2 inches.
Yeah. The problem with that though is you're just going to end up packing it right back down again when you roll over it with that second set of wheels. I mean, I don't know for sure, but personally I would say that's probably not the best course of action. I think you'd be better off with, if you got an old drag, set that old drag as aggressive as possible and maybe go over it twice, we all, there's some tools out there that are really awesome and could really help, but we all have different budgets too. I started from scratch, rented all the ground, bought equipment as I could afford. And so, maybe we can talk about a little bit later, what are the first things you should buy and what can you do if you're on a limited budget versus an unlimited budget. So, yeah, our situations are all different and we don't get all have the tools that we'd like. Like our TK, I can see the value in it and I'd love to have it, but there's just other things I've needed to purchase before that. So.
Going off of that right there, what's the best cultivator for the budget? Start. Front mount, rear mount?
The best cultivator, question is about the brand of cultivator. The best cultivator is a Buffalo, but it's not the cheapest. So I guess there's a trade-off. Is that?
But on the same side, even if you're on a budget, it's better to invest in something that's good than something that's gonna not even work bigger issues.
Yeah.
It's true.
I think one of the other things too is the thing wore out or is it in good condition too? And I've never used a Buffalo, so I'm not going to say it's not bad. I run mostly John Deere ones. The good part about that is I've got parts wherever and whenever I need them. But after we're done with this, we are going to move right into cultivators, and so maybe I'll keep that question in mind, and maybe some things to look for on used cultivators, so you don't try to get a lemon.
I just did a search for that Einbach harrow. I can't even find one in the U.S. Where did you get that?
Yeah.
Let's say that again so we can get it on the video.
The question is about where do you find the Einbach equipment? There is a dealer in Minnesota, that guy?
Illinois.
Okay.
I got a phone number.
Yeah. It comes from Austria, but yeah, there are dealers. Service is not real good in my experience. Yeah,
Like GUY, Guy Machinery? Okay. Out of Illinois. And Einbach is spelled EINBOCK, right?
right.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next one.
Oh yeah, this is what I was talking about as far as my clodbuster, and I'm probably again the only guy in the world that does this. But this is a Buffalo rolling stock chopper, and after you cultivate, especially if it's a little bit damp or in the wheel track, you're going to get some of those clods. And if you've got big weeds, they're just laying there, and if it rains, they might grow again. But if I go over it with this, there's two gangs, a wider wheel on the front and a narrower one in back. It breaks all those clods up. Any big weeds that are laying there get kind of chopped up in pieces, so they're going to dry. It spreads the trash, the residue, back uniformly over the surface again. So it takes this and makes it look like that. And yeah, it's an extra trip, but I go really fast and just idle with the tractor, and I think it's worth it. But it's not the thing you're going to spend the money on first, all right? All right. Your turn.
Okay. Mind if I have that laser pointer? I might need it.
Sure, which one points? I turned it off once already.
Did you?
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So some of these pictures are my equipment and some are just representative of online because I didn't have the cultivator hooked up to the tractor at the time. But like I said, For the early cultivations, I like the front mount cultivator. So here's a picture of a smaller front mount cultivator on that's a 50 series John Deere tractor. So anyways, my tractor doesn't have the cab, and it's got 12 rows on it. I like the open station. I mean, it sucks for creature comfort, but I can see so much better. I can easily see what every row is doing. If one row is plugged, I don't have to turn all the way back around and then get off my row and cause myself problems. In the early cultivations, I'm using these shields very strategically. So this is a close-up picture of my front mount cultivator. I drop the shields down to the ground when it's the early cultivations, because the sweeps will bury the crop if you don't. Another little trick I do to speed up the early cultivations is, see how there's, on the John Deere anyways, and actually on a lot of cultivators, there's 3 main shanks in between each row. I lift this middle one completely out of the ground, because this middle one can throw clods over to the row and knock the plants down. So I just take that completely out, because I can kill the weeds in the middle of the row easy later. But that allows me to go quite a bit faster, and even when the crop is small. So that's a little trick I learned. And as the crop gets a little bigger and a little bigger, you slowly raise these shields up. See, there's a chain right there. There's a little notch where you can raise it up the chain every link. As the crop gets bigger, you want to raise those shields up and throw a little more dirt underneath that plant and continually keep burying the weeds that are right up in the row. Just trying to think. There's so many things you can talk about a cultivator. Like I said, there's a lot of different brands out there. They have this similar design, the 3 shanks, and then you've got the parallel linkages. That's one big issue you want to look for in a cultivator is take that back shank if it's off the ground and wiggle that and see how much play there is in those parallel. Maybe you can see it better. There's parallel linkages in this one down here. If you take that back shank, if it's up off the ground, and wiggle it back and forth, is it tight? If it has a couple inches of play, you want your sweeps in tight when you're cultivating, as tight as you can do it and still drive. And so if there's a bunch of play there, that means you have to replace a bunch of bushings, or maybe you just need to tighten up those bolts. But it's something to really look out for in the cultivators. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
You can put cutaway disc on the front of that cultivator. And that's to just cut away from the rounder front mount cultivator.
Yep, I've had those. I had them on a rear mount back when I was wide rows, and I sold that one. But yeah, you can. Yeah, instead of there's lots of different shields. There's flat shields that don't these roll as they go along the ground, but there's flat shields too that just stay on the ground. And then, like Tom said, there's actually single disc blades that you can mount on here in lieu of that extra shank, and you can either cut dirt away from the row, or you can bring dirt to the row. So you can create your ridges with that too, if you had them. Okay, yeah, go ahead. So I'm only seeing, who else was it? Okay. How wide are the sweeps on your Sioux Cup?
Probably 16.
Okay. And what row spacing are you going to be at?
It's 30-inch rows.
Okay. So you're going to cover 16 inches of that 30. You've got a lot of inches on both sides. And when I and other guys that I know of, we're keeping, you want to get these 2 points as close to the crop as you can. That's maybe like a 4 to 5 inch spacing, and you want to be able to cover everything in between. So I would say for your Sioux Cup, maybe that last tillage pass, put the shields on it. That can help you get the ridge and bury some weeds You know, when the corn's this high and it's rigid, you can throw dirt in the row and bury things. That'd be the cultivator to use. But for your early cultivations, that one's not going to cut it unless you would get a lot wider sweeps or go to a 3 or a 5 shank cultivator, so you can spread those out and get them closer to that row.
Doug?
Question, you do not have the cutaway discs that go along the road? No, I don't. That is a third pass machine, that's not a first or a second pass machine.
Yeah, yep. Okay, sorry.
Someone designed a little plate that goes right in the back of your shovels, not on your shovels, but above cultivators.
Okay,
Yeah.
we better keep
Yep.
going.
And the reason I chose these cultivators is simply because they were out there, they were available. I'm not saying it's the best, but you know, if you're just starting out, you've got a limited budget, you can find these cultivators, you can find these shields. They still make parts for them, and so that's a good thing. If you want to play around with it and add different things on these, these bars that hold the shanks on, you can have some longer ones custom made. It's just standard square tube steel. If you're handy with a welder or have the tools, or your local weld shop, they can help you fab up some stuff too. One thing about the older models, their parallel linkages are very narrow. You can see that whole parallel linkage system is maybe only that wide. Every series newer that John Deere made, they made those parallel linkages wider. This is like the latest version of the cultivator, the 856 they make, and that's about that wide. It just adds a lot more stability and rigidity, and keeping that row unit in place, and I think that's important too. So, the newer ones are more expensive, but they also have some other nice features. I don't know if you can see right here that little crank. That crank is for the depth control wheel on each row unit. So instead of crawling underneath here and loosening 2 bolts, you can just stand on the back there and give that a crank, and you can make adjustments there. There's also adjustment holes for the shanks too, so you can have each one consistent. Whereas on the old ones here, it's just kind of slide it up and guess with some U-bolts. So they did make some improvements in the newer cultivators. There's a lot of different a lot of different sweeps you can get too, sweep sizes. Some that are more of a lower profile, they don't throw as much dirt. Some that are angled a little bit more, so they do throw dirt. There's a lot of different combinations out there. Let me talk about this tool for a while. It's an electro-hydraulic tool. It's not new. It was made in the late 80s, I think, maybe even before that. It didn't really catch on conventionally because guys were going to Roundup, but anyways, it's pretty useful in organics, but really in the later cultivations. What it does is you mount that on the 3-point of the tractor, and then you mount the cultivator on that tool. We call it a navigator. That's a brand name. There's other companies that make cultivator guidance systems, and so those little steel bars down there sense where the crop is, sense where the rows are, and then this whole plate there's a hydraulic cylinder back here. It moves the cultivator side to side based on where the rows are. So you can drive down the field, and this, you keep your tractor in between the rows, and this will fine tune it for you. These run, I don't know if you can get a good deal on them, a few $100. If you go to kind of a dealer or someone that sells them, you might have to pay $1,000 or whatever. But if you're running a rear mount cultivator, that's a really helpful tool, and it's fairly low tech, and a lot less expensive than like a RTK guidance system. So there was a question in the back.
How does that work with contour? I have issues sometimes when I go around and hang contour, I start getting the higher corners.
Yeah, and like, are you talking side hill too, or just making curves? Okay. So the question is, how do the navigators work on contours and side hills, or curves? I would say on the curves, well, there's a lot of different places you can position these wands. you can get it out front of the cultivator a few feet so it has more time to react, or you could play with that a little bit. When I'm going around a curve, I just slow down to give it more time to react. On a side hill, some of these navigators came with a side hill compensator, is a little box that sat on top, and some didn't. So if you're looking for one of those and if you have side hills, look for an extra little square box on the top. It has a pendulum inside there, and it'll help you compensate for side hill too. So
One of the limiting factors on this with those wands, though, is they don't work very well on really small crops, and that's where you really need the guidance. But in my experience, small corn is just not stiff enough to move those wands. And if you have a weed or if you have a piece of trash, that's a lot stiffer than the crop is. So you might end up guiding it to cultivate all your crop.
yeah, it's not a tool for the small crop. It's a tool for when it gets a little larger, but it does help reduce operator fatigue, and you can set your sweeps in closer when the crop does get large. You can go faster. So yeah, it's definitely not an end all be all. It's not your silver bullet, but it's a tool that helps. Okay, we run it. All right. I'll switch it for you. How's that sound?
Another thing you can use is a cultivision mirror. I have these on both sides of my tractors so that I can just look, out that little window on the side, depending on where the dust is, and I can see my mirror on either side. I look right down the outside of those rear wheels, and it's almost like having a front mount cultivator once you get used to it, without the stiff neck and the sore back that goes with leaning over and watching a front mount cultivator. I wouldn't cultivate without it myself. They're cheap, and they still make them. Yeah, Barney.
Yeah, where do you get them? I called somebody years ago about one and they never called back.
They still make them.
Okay, I think I just sold mine.
Okay. These are called Cultivision mirrors. I don't know if other companies make them or not, but they are still made. Yeah.
Next one.
Yeah. Maybe we'll kind of gloss over the RTK in the interest of time. We can talk about that later if we have time.
Yeah. Basically, the RTK guides the tractor. You can use it for cultivation, but you can use it for planting and everything else in between. The other high-tech option would be to, they're just coming out with these. I've never used one. I don't know how it works. But, whoops, sorry. But there's a camera mounted up there. The camera senses the crop row and then moves the cultivator with a navigator system with that hydraulic side-to-side motion, similar to what we saw in the previous slide. It just, instead of using those metal wands, it will sense the row, visually through a computer and a camera. And I think theoretically it can see very small crop too. So that might be a good option for even when the crop's small. I wonder how well it works though if you get a heavy rain and your corn's this high and your weeds right beside it are this high. I wonder how it can sense it then. So it can. You say that again? It looks at 3 rows at a time. Okay.
How does it work though if you have a crosswind where, if the wind is blowing your crop sideways, it looks different going one way than it does the other way? Yeah. Doug has some experience with it.
In the processor for that, what the algorithm is doing is simply it's looking for symmetry. Weeds are not in rows. So it's finding those. They're, for the most part, not ready to run.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, maybe not out there, but something to look at in the future. Probably going to be pretty expensive though.
Anybody using these little finger weeders? Nobody. They kind of intrigue me.
Scott.
Scott, are you? What's your experience?
I like them. I think they, it kind of depends on your soil structure at the time sometimes.
Yeah.
And you can just go through the same pass. I mean, you look back and it's just kind of exploding that dirt right in the row, and then other times
Do you have,
You got a crust,
do you have this brand?
don't think so.
The interesting thing about these is there's another spoke wheel underneath of those yellow ones, and
They all have that.
they all,
Yeah,
I don't
that's
think,
what drives it.
yeah, which is a neat concept because those fingers are a little bit shorter, so the tips of those yellow fingers are actually going a little faster than what the ground is going past them, right? Which is kind of clever.
Yeah.
But we,
Question is, what crops is he currently using them on?
we did both corn and beans.
Both corn and beans. Okay.
Okay.
Come on the cultivator that you just showed.
The Einbach. Yeah, Einbach makes one. Yeah,
Okay. So
On the rear of that cultivator.
right.
yeah, this cultivator is an Einbach as well, just like that orange harrow we were talking about earlier. And so we're
The issue comes is that they sit so far back on that cultivator, if you are doing any contour or any curves, that it's so narrowed up that either you're tearing it out behind it or you're tearing out in front of it. If you have nice straight square fields, it's the best machine you can get from.
okay. We've got 5 minutes, and we probably have more slides than 5 minutes. So, well, let's try to.
Oh, just we'll go through this really fast. We're talking a lot about a lot of trips through the field, and you guys that are new to this, you're going to hear this in the coffee shop, how much energy you're using when you're out there driving up and down the field. But in reality, 2 trips with a rotary hoe and 2 trips with a cultivator uses, sorry about the metric units, but uses 585 megajoules per hectare, whereas 1 application of Roundup uses 763, and that's not even applying it. That's just the material. And the biggest energy user for the conventional guy is nitrogen fertilizer, which is tremendously energy intensive. In fact, 1% of all the fossil fuel energy used in the world goes to making anhydrous ammonia. So don't let anybody bully you around on that. David Pimentel, Cornell University, I think, did this. These 2 are organic systems, and this is conventional. And obviously that's an average, but we use about 2/3 of the fossil fuel energy of the conventional guy, almost entirely because of the nitrogen fertilizer. Just some pretty pictures. Oh yeah, like I said, sometimes it doesn't look beautiful. This is my bean field, and these 2 pictures were taken in exactly the same place. If you look at those trees back there, maybe an hour apart after I went through it with my buffalo cultivator. It can look pretty bad and clean up pretty good. This is a different year, all right? Same sort of a thing. And that's the buffalo cultivator that did it. And the next one, they made about 55 bushel per acre. So, it doesn't always work that way, but it can.
All right, we wanted to spend a little time, and it will be a little time, on some really problem weeds in organic rotation. Giant ragweed, Canada thistle. I haven't seen Palmer amaranth yet, but I'm sure eventually in my lifetime we will. I just wanted to make a quick note on nightshade and soybeans. It's not a weed that really kills yield probably too bad, but you don't want those little berries in your food grade organic beans because it'll stain the beans and they can reject them. So for you newbies out there, just be really careful of nightshade, okay? Giant ragweed. It germinates early, so that delayed planting can help control this. It's a fast-growing yield robber, and it really makes small grain harvest tough. Another thing, though, it doesn't go to seed generally till after you get your small grains out, if you get in the field and get your small grains out timely. So some of those rotation and cultural practices can help. Canada thistle, this is a bad one. When I went full-time, I started renting a farm that had been organic for a while. Not the best managed. Had a lot of thistle out there. It was spread out, and then I had those really concentrated patches too. We've spent a few, we just don't have the time to go into what all I did to get that, but we've had some good success controlling these thistles. One of the little products I wanted to mention, I found this works well for Canada thistle. If you spray it on a nice sunny day when it's still kind of more in the vegetative stage and not in the tough rank stage, but it'll burn it back down to the ground. It turns it black in a couple hours and wilts it. Now, it will hurt all crops, but if you've got some spots out in the field, you don't feel like pulling them, or they're around the fence row, you can use some of this stuff and keep them at bay. It's not going to kill them at the roots, but it'll prevent them from going to seed until you can get in there with the combine, like in small grains. So it has its places. I've used it. It works well in a good sunny hot day. So
I think we're out of time. I heard.
Okay.
Well, I think Scott and I will be around for a little while now. If you have more questions, we didn't quite get through all our slides, but
yeah, so
thank you very
I guess
much
we needed
for
more
your
time.
attention.